Greetings. I'm Wendy Baldwin, President and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This webinar introduces our 2013 World Population Data Sheet, which gives you up-to-the-minute information about population characteristics of all of the countries of the world, and some extra topics in addition to that. And we'd like to introduce this with a webinar so that we can sort of share some of the highlights of that with you and take your questions as well. Today's webinar will be a conversation with me and with Carl Haub, our senior demographer. But before we launch into the aspects of population that I know you're waiting to hear about, Taijen Sai is going to give you some technical information that will help make this webinar go smoothly.
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome everyone. As technical producer of today's webinar, I'd like to note a few things before we begin. You can participate in the webinar by submitting a question for Wendy or Carl using the questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Type in your question and click send. We'll answer as many questions as possible after the presentation portion. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please submit a question and we'll answer you immediately. We are recording this webinar. The recording, including the PowerPoint presentation, will be available soon on our website at www.prb.org. Now, I would like to introduce Carl Haub, PRB Senior Demographer and co-author with Toshiko Kaneda of this year's data sheet. Carl?
Hi, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone out there who's listening. We're glad you're here. Of course, many of you know that each year we produce the World Population Data Sheet, and quite a bit of data collection and research goes into it. And one of our main goals is to find the very latest information. So we have a fairly short lead time in production, and we are able to include very, very recent data. And we hope you find it useful, especially for that reason. To put world population growth into perspective, let's take a look at the 20th century, which truly was, I think, the century of population. We began in 1900 with 1.6 billion. And a mere 100 years later, an odd statistical quirk had happened is those two numbers changed places to 6.1. It's always good when you have something like this because it's easy to remember. But think just what that means, from 1.6 to 6.1 billion in just 100 years. Today, world population 13 years later has added another billion and stands at about 7.1. Now let's look over history, how this came about. And one interesting thing that people often ask about is, when did we add each of these billions? Well, it took us all of human history for the first billion to be reached. Now think about that. 50,000 plus years. Throughout all of that time, the human race battled with mortality, wars, plagues, famines, you name it. It was tough going to get to that first billion. The second billion, though, arrived quite rapidly in 130 years. So think about that. It took us 50,000 for the first and just 130 for the second. The third billion came in 1960. In only 30 years. And this really, too, is about when terms like the population bomb or population explosion became popular. In fact, I came across a cover of Time magazine from 1960 that had a full cover story on that population explosion, which I think is pretty interesting because it sort of acted in 1960 as if everybody knew about it. But the most rapid growth was yet to come. The fourth billion came in 14 years, the fifth in 13, the sixth also, it came in 12, and the seventh billion in 12 years. But now how about that eighth? And that's something we'll be talking about for the next few minutes. The 8th billion right now is projected to come at about 13 years, in the year 20 to 24. Now this is a picture that we've all seen for some time now, the fact that all population growth in the world will be in developing countries. We can also see that the poorest countries, as designated by the UN, the least developed, most of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, are gaining their share of the developing countries. since their birth rates are much higher. The developed countries, virtually no growth. The great declines in birth rates in those countries has virtually ensured that many will decline or they won't grow at all. So essentially, all world population growth has now shifted over to the developing regions. Yeah, Wendy.
So Carl, when you say, well, you've seen this slide before, that doesn't mean that it hasn't been updated, right? This actually includes the most recent data that we have and
sure.
the most up-to-the-minute projections.
Sure, and the most up-to-minute projections. But the picture is really what we have been looking at. And it's not often, I think, really known, or it certainly doesn't always show up in writing where all the growth really is. Now, for one thing, we're looking at population out to 2050. How do we know this? How can we say with confidence that the picture will look like that? Well, here's one really important reason why. We have two pyramids to show you, population pyramids, and you've probably seen them before. They show the age and sex distribution of a particular population. In this case, it's the developed countries. And what do we see there? Throughout Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, which is represented here, we see that there's hardly any young people. What would that mean if the birth rate, in fact, even rose in some low fertility countries? Not as much as is often thought, because there simply are very, very few potential parents moving up the age ladder. And the next pyramid is of the developing countries, and it's done on exactly the same scale, so the shape and size is just like, 1-to-1. It's exactly equal. And that's how we know that virtually all population growth in the next 37 or plus years will be in the developing countries. What we cannot be absolutely certain of is how much, but it certainly is going to be a great deal. Each year, the number of people who enter the childbearing years increases and increases and goes up and up. So what the real key here is how many children are they going to have? Our focus this year is on sub-Saharan Africa, the countries with the greatest potential increase in terms of percentage and also in terms of absolute numbers. Sub-Saharan Africa had only 170 million people in 1950. By 2050, it's expected to rise to over 2 billion. Now, that over 2 billion is not exactly exact, is it? It's not quite precise, and we'll see why in a moment. At the same time as it's growing, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the world's youngest region by far, notice only 43% of the people are below the age of 15, while only 16% are below the age of 15 in Europe. And that's below the age of 15, not 20 or not 25, as you sometimes see. In the future, Sub-Saharan Africa's population will get a little bit older, but by 2050, it still has about 1/3 of the population below the age of 15. And look at that group 65 plus. It's only 3% today. And incidentally, Sub-Saharan Africa's population has been 3% 65 and over for many, many, many years, going way back into the 1960s. Yet that will only increase to 4%. And now we look at Europe, for example. The percent of the population below the age of 15 is more or less expected to stay the same, about 16%, way less than Sub-Saharan Africa. By 2050, in Europe, the percent 65 and over will have risen to 27%. And of course, 27% in Europe is one thing, but of course, other countries vary greatly. Japan, for example, will have in 2050 almost 40% of its population 65 and over. And what does this mean? One thing that occurs to me, beyond the fact that the developed countries will need labor force, they will have difficulty supporting their old age pensions, and will have enormous bills for the medical care of people in nursing homes and of very advanced ages, far more than they've ever seen before. but they will also have a more constrained budget, so that the willingness and the ability to provide foreign aid has become more and more of a concern.
Can I just put a little gender spin on that one too? When we look at these population pyramids, even for the developing countries, at the oldest ages, 70, 75 above, there is a really clear sex difference. There are more women at the oldest ages. And so when you look at a country that's going to have a real growth in that older population, the chances are that's going to make an even greater impact on the sex distribution within that country. And I think that has implications for what kind of government services are needed and who those caregivers are.
Sure.
They've typically been the caregivers in a family. We're going to have more, it's always more women in those oldest ages.
Oh yes, oh, absolutely, sure. I mean, the sex ratio at the older ages always favors women, certainly. And your point, though, too, about the old is very significant, because large numbers of people now survive into their 80s and even some into their 90s, of course. And that's where medical care can become really expensive. Long-term care, nursing homes and such. And, you know, again, that's something that we haven't dealt that much with in the past.
On the other side of that, of course, what we've seen in the U.S. is falling rates of disability, such that even at some older ages, which several generations ago might have been ages where people really couldn't care for themselves, there's really less disability. So you really have to balance off longevity and disability.
Sure. The retirement ages we have now are looking a little bit too young in some ways. Now, before we saw that sub-Saharan Africa is projected to rise to, as I said, at least 2 billion. So we're not going to be very precise about that. But here's a key that really has to be taken to heart, is all of our population projections for countries that have relatively high fertility make one big assumption, that fertility will decline over the next 30 to 40 years. That has to happen for that 2 billion or so to take place. If not, the projected population size is going to be much above, in sub-Saharan Africa, what we're currently showing today on our world data sheet. So we have a really big assumption that underlies that 2050 number that we looked at. And here's some examples that shows different patterns. These 4 countries are kind of representative of what's been going on in sub-Saharan Africa. And generally what we see is fairly slow decline, or we see decline that slows down. It has a bit of a pause if we, for example, look at Ghana before it resumes, or it flattens out, or in some cases it may even have risen a little bit. Now, one thing I also like to emphasize is, how do we know this? And what we have at our disposal today, and actually have since the 1970s, quite a long time, are demographic surveys that provide data for countries in the developing world for which we would have very, very little. These surveys, such as the demographic and health surveys and the mixed surveys from UNICEF, paint a really complete portrait of what's going on in these countries. Another table that we've shown in the past that's proven pretty popular is the demographic divide. So here we have 2 countries, Niger and Netherlands, one developing, obviously, one industrialized, with about the same size population today. By 2050, look at Niger, 66 million, nearly 4 times increase. And again, that has an assumption that underlies it, that Niger's birth rate will slowly come down between now and 2050. The annual number of births between these 2 countries of equal population size, the difference between them is enormous. The number of children that are born in these 2 different countries to women, the gap is about the widest we've ever seen worldwide in history, 7.6 to 1.7. And of course, there's many developed countries, especially in Europe and Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, where the birth rate, the lifetime births per woman, is well below 1.7. Partly due to the large number of births and partly due to the higher infant mortality rate you can see there, 51 in Niger, 3.7 in the Netherlands. 43,000 infants die every year approximately in Niger. That's a really big number. And the sad part of that is it can be avoided.
You know, Carl, I was looking at that and thinking we have a lot of listeners in the U.S., and is there a way to make that number sort of pop and be more real for those of us who are sitting in the United States? So I looked around at, Florida is a little bit larger than Niger in population size. And last year, Florida experienced 1,400 infant deaths. And if you can imagine the difference between 1,400 infant deaths and 43,000, the context for childbearing in Niger is just so different. And many feel that it's when families feel that when they have a child, the child will survive, that they really focus much more on controlling fertility and having fewer births. So it's important to look both at that birth rate and also at what that just day-to-day experience is of childbearing in these different settings.
Yes, certainly, yes. And I think the last line, too, is important because it's an excellent way of looking at the depths of poverty that still exist in many developing countries. In Niger, the gross national income per capita is $650 a year for every man, woman, and child. It's not even a fraction of that in the Netherlands at $43,000. So how does fertility come down? It's probably a bit of a no-brainer that if couples use family planning, that the birth rate will come down. But of course, that assumes a large number of things. One is that they, in fact, have the desire to lower their fertility, and the other is, if they do, are family planning services available? And when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we can easily see that the use of family planning in that region lags far, far behind many other developing countries, in fact, almost all. Bangladesh has a use of family planning that is very similar to that of an industrialized country. And remember, it too is very poor, yet the use of family planning is quite high.
And Carl, there's another way to look at this, which is not just what women are doing in using family planning, but maybe what they'd like to do. And so a measure that a lot of people are talking about now is unmet need for family planning. How many women say that they would like to be limiting their childbearing, but are not using a method? And we find those numbers are pretty high. Now, you have to unbundle that to know what that actually means. It could mean that they can't get access to a method. There aren't supplies available. It can mean that they're afraid of side effects, that they're afraid of the health impact of the methods they can get access to. And of course it could mean that their husband or another family member objects so that their wishes are not the only wishes that have to be taken into account. But when you look at unmet need, if you look at some sub-Saharan countries, we've looked at Rwanda, Malawi, Uganda. In some cases it looks like half of women, married women, say they would use contraception, but they're not. I think that tells us there's a real opening there to both help women do what they would like to do and start to bring this fertility down a bit.
Oh, certainly, yes. Indeed, it is frustrating if women in the country do wish to limit their number of children and just simply don't have the ability or they don't have the free choice. Another way we can evaluate what might happen in the birth rate in sub-Saharan Africa, in this case, is to look at, in surveys, how many children do they say is ideal? Now, that's a little bit subjective, that's certainly true, but the level and the trend in that particular measure tells us quite a bit. There has been a drop in the ideal number of children in some sub-Saharan African countries, but it appears to have stabilized. Does that portend a decline in the future, or will the birth rate roughly stay the same? And as we've looked at in the projections for Africa, that is a major consideration. In a country like Niger, the ideal number of children is very high. Women say 9, and although it's not shown here, men in Niger say 11 is their ideal number of children. And these are traditions that are likely not to go away anytime soon. Now we turn to the wealthy countries, the developed or industrialized countries, as you will. It's fairly well known, I think, that there's been a very large drop in the birth rate in most of the industrialized countries to very, very low levels. And this actually came as a shock. This was not expected. But we see that in Germany, the total fertility rate, or the average number of children a woman would bear in her lifetime, fell to 1.5 or less 40 years ago in 1970. This has created a rather permanent alteration to the age distribution, as we'll see in the next slide, simply meaning that there are now very, very few young people compared to the past. The same thing has happened in Italy, although it came down a little bit later. But notice the gap between France and the other two. France is well known for very good supportive families, both with daycare and child allowances and all kinds of other benefits for young families to help them afford raising children. The other two countries have not done as well. One other country that's had success, in fact one of the very few by the way, is Russia. Putin has offered large cash payments from the year 2000, and the Russian birth rate, the total fertility rate, has risen from about 1.2 to about 1.7. Although it's interesting that the cash payments are only for the second child and above, not for the first. But it does actually seem to have worked up until now. So now we see the effect of low fertility. And when we looked way back when at that slide that showed very little population growth in the developed countries, here's why. In Japan, which we'll use as an example here, the youngest population group, 0 to 4, those born 5 years within the last 5 years, are just about half the size of the largest age group, 40 to 44. So in other words, essentially the number of potential parents in Japan has been cut in two, really. Now these developed countries are quite concerned about it, and they are doing their best. They're trying one thing or another, cash payments in some cases, improving daycare, to raise the birth rate to avoid the economic burden that unprecedented aging is going to cause. So now I'm turning on over to Wendy. Wendy, take it away, please.
Thank you, Carl. Let's kind of take a look a little bit about some things that are happening in the United States. And here is a population pyramid for the United States for the white non-Hispanic population. That's about 203 million out of the more than 300 million people in the United States. And a couple of things jump out here. The first is, of course, the baby boom. And you can see the baby boom. You can see the baby boom on this. And that's the bulge. We've relabeled this a bulge because boom to me is kind of the wrong way to think about this. To me, a boom is something that happens quickly and then it's over. But the change in the birth rate after World War II really was a protracted event, so it's created a large bulge in our population. And that's a bulge that's about to move into the retirement years. And so we've, of course, heard a lot about what that will mean. It will, of course, mean greater demand for services for older populations, but it means other things, too. Look at that gender difference at 85 and above that we talked about earlier. Many more women at those oldest ages. Another thing that pops out from this is looking at the bottom of the pyramid. Each successive generation, down from the teenagers, down to the younger children, down to infants, is smaller than the one before it, which means that overall we really do have an aging population here. It looks a lot like the other high-income or industrialized countries that Carl's been telling us about, but that baby boom was more protracted in the United States, so we're feeling more of an effect as that moves through different eras of life.
And you know, Wendy, something that does not show up there is in this population of white non-Hispanics, which is what we use loosely for majority, is the number of births and deaths now are equal. So it's not growing from what we call natural increase.
Absolutely, you're right. Now, the next graph here is the Hispanic population in the United States. And this gives you a very different picture. It's a much younger population. It doesn't, of course, have the baby boom effect that we saw earlier. In 1950, which is sort of when the baby boom was really rolling, there was a very small percentage of the population was Hispanic. So much of what's happened to the U.S. population in the Hispanic population in the U.S. has been a much more recent phenomenon. There's a much higher proportion of the population that's Hispanic that's in the working ages. And in addition to fertility behavior, we of course have immigration patterns as well. Fertility is higher among the Hispanic population, but if we look at what's happening recently, it's very interesting. Everyone has been affected by the recent recession, but the relationship here for the Hispanic fertility has been really quite stunning. This is quite a significant decline. And now the gap between Hispanic and white non-Hispanic birth rates has really been about cut in half. So if Hispanic fertility stays where it is now, it would still help to keep the U.S. population younger. And overall, the U.S. fertility rate is higher than that we see in the countries in Europe.
And it'll also be interesting to see now with the recession maybe slowly coming to an end if Hispanic fertility would recover.
Sort of like housing could recover.
Yes.
Right. Many of these things go hand in hand. But talking about the recession kind of makes us think more generally about the impact of income on population measures. And in the World Population Data Sheet this year, we include several different measures of income. There is the gross national income per person, which you've heard mentioned already, where in the developed countries it averages about $36,000, and in the least developed about $1,430. So we would expect that. But let's look at some comparisons, both of countries, and then we're going to look at within countries and see what happens. But looking across countries, how is that income distributed? So we're going to talk about the poorest fifth in the population and the wealthiest fifth in the population. So in the United States, the poorest fifth have about 3% of that income, and the wealthiest have 51%. Not very dissimilar from Brazil, even though the overall level of income is much higher in the United States. But that level of distribution, that disparity, is about the same. It's a very different picture in India and Finland. Again, two very different countries. They have very different levels of average income, and yet much more equal distribution. Finland, with the poorest fifth still getting 10% of overall income, and the wealthiest fifth 37%. That's really a significant difference. But differences aren't just between and across countries. If you look within a country, those different groups look very different on many factors that are important for population. So again, we're looking at the poorest fifth and the wealthiest fifth and the groups in between. So if you take Uganda, for example, among the poorest fifth, the lifetime number of births per woman is almost 8, and it's 4 for the wealthiest fifth. That's half the level of childbearing in the wealthiest fifth of that population. And then if we look on to say, well, what are some of those other characteristics of the groups by income? We see education. So we know that we're not surprised to see that better educated families are represented among the wealthiest fifth. But this is a really stunning difference. In the poorest fifth of households, when you look at women of reproductive age, 86% have no schooling. When you get up to the wealthiest fifth, it's only 4%. And schooling of women is very important because it is often a trigger for a whole lot of other investments in the family and especially in children. We know that mother's education has a tremendous impact on child well-being and even on child mortality. Let's look at this is perhaps the bluntest measure of child well-being. Let's look at child death rates. So this is the under 5 mortality per 1,000 births, and looking again at those wealth quintiles. Now we've moved around the globe a little bit, and we're looking at Cambodia. Among the households who have the poorest fifth in the population, the mortality rate is 77 deaths per 1,000 live births. But if you go to those wealthiest households, it's only 23. That's a tremendous difference there. One other way of looking at this is to say, let's look at a whole population, and what do those population pyramids look like if you look at the youngest, at the wealthiest or the poorest group. And for this, we're back to Africa, and we're looking at Malawi. So in Malawi, this is the population pyramid for the poorest fifth of the population. And I think you're probably not surprised to see that fertility is very high at 6.8, and to see those bottom bars in this pyramid be very large. I think what's surprising in this is how much a effect you see at the later ages, how shortened those bars are. And in fact, what you're seeing there is the impact of adult mortality.
HIV. And HIV, too. Of course.
Yes,
you know.
of course, as one of the causes of adult mortality. But there are, of course, many other causes.
Right,
and
right.
some of these populations, now we focus so much on tuberculosis and HIV and malaria, the diseases that have been a scourge in much of sub-Saharan Africa. But in all of them, now we're seeing an increase in diabetes and cardiovascular disease. These countries urbanize. We see an increase in traffic accidents. And so we see this very disrupted pattern. But let's go on and look at that wealthiest fifth. So it looks a little more like a traditional pattern pyramid that we would expect for a developing country. We see the fertility rate is much lower. And boy, look at that bottom bar. That really is an indication of recent declines in fertility. So on our world population data sheet this year, we give you all of those familiar measures of population size and level and factors for all of the countries of the world. But we also give you an interactive map. So you can go and look at a topic of your particular interest, and as you scroll over the map, you can see the levels and find the data. There's also a new infographic that's very interactive, and I think it brings some new topics to bear. It brings out some of the growth. There's information there on the megacities around the globe, and I think that's going to surprise some people when they find some of the megacities. That's over 10 million people. Some of those megacities may be cities they haven't heard of before. So there's a lot there for you. A lot of it's very interactive. If you see something you like, it's very easy to get more information about it, and so we're encouraging you to go take a look at that data sheet and the associated graphics. And now we're open for questions. So you have a chance here to type in your question, and then as we get to them, either Carl or I will answer them. So the first question we have here is, why do we make the assumption that fertility will decline? And I guess I'd like to hear Carl's addition to this, but actually that's what we've seen all around the globe over the last 100 years is fertility does decline. Countries become more industrialized. Families are able to control their fertility. They want to have smaller families. They see the importance of investing in the children that they have so that the children are able to participate more in a changing economy.
Wendy, that is definitely a frequently asked question. Why do we assume that fertility will decline in developing countries? Well, we actually, most of it's used the United Nations as a good source, of the U.S. Census Bureau, and when PRB makes projections, we do the same thing. And it's as you said. What are you really going to assume? And the idea is that if we look at Africa, the fundamental assumption made is that it will have the same decline in fertility as it did, say, Latin America and Asia and other areas of the developing world. However, the United Nations produces not just one projection. The medium one is the one we tend to use because it's in the middle, but there's also a high and low projection, and even one that shows what would happen if fertility did not change. So by looking at the UN projections, we can have quite a few choices, not just that medium one. Even though urbanization frequently means fairly small towns, we tend to think of it in terms of, say, Shanghai or Delhi or New York. But even a move into a small town, and I guess off the farm, if you will, that tends to lower fertility. That's been seen in demographic surveys time and time again.
Okay, we have a question here about what's the best fertility level. Boy, I wouldn't get out and want to say what fertility level was best. I think a lot of us feel that the most important thing is that couples have an opportunity to have the number of children that they say they want, and that's not always the case. Clearly, different levels of fertility mean that societies have to adapt in different ways. And over the years, we have seen that countries can make many different adaptations to changes in their workforce. With technology changes, are we going to see more productivity at older ages? I think we see that already than the kind of productivity we might have expected from 60-year-olds a couple of generations ago. It's really different now, so I think it's pretty hard to say what's that one right level.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of opinions, and you sort of pays your money and takes your choice. Now, that famous two-child, 2.1, level of fertility, which we call replacement because couples just replace themselves, will in the long run guarantee the zero population growth and that births will ultimately equal deaths and will have a predictable age structure. Others would say that a lower level is desirable because then society would consume less. So really it's a matter of, the direction which you come at it.
And when we said Hispanic fertility might recover in the U.S., that wasn't necessarily to say that it should be higher, that would be a good thing, merely that it would, we don't know how either Hispanic or non-Hispanic fertility will respond to changes as we come out of a recession.
Yeah, recover in a sense is kind of a colored word a little bit in that, although people say it all the time, but to recover is a good thing, well, maybe not necessarily.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, here's a question really close to my heart. Is there any focus on men when it comes to education about fertility rates in developing countries? Yes, not enough. In my view, the answer is yes, but. In many countries, we know that the men's views about childbearing and the views about the use of contraception are very important in the family, and they may differ from what the women want. And I think it's a challenge for service deliverers to understand best ways to get messages to men and help men see how they can best support their families. How can they help make that good investment in their wife's health, in the children's health, and access health services that are ones that are acceptable to them? I think you've put your finger on a very important issue.
Well, yes, and I think perhaps it's been most successful in HIV campaigns, which had tended to involve men probably more than family planning. I've also been in some countries in Central America where the introduction of the injection is what brought down the fertility rate, because women could get that by themselves and almost secretly. So at times it has to be like that too.
Maybe not the best way.
Maybe not the best way, but...
One of the things that I thought was interesting about that ideal family size is that often ideal family size is higher than what people are actually doing. There may be an ideal as to what a family size should be, but then the realities of day-to-day life, of providing for those children and the health effects on the mom and the needs to support the children and their health, sometimes the actual childbearing is lower than those stated ideals. So maybe I'm not as worried about the men in Niger saying they want 11 children.
Oh yeah, I would doubt we would ever see a total fertility rate that high. But also in developed countries, in surveys, most women say they would like more than 2 children, including the low fertility countries.
We say, one of the questions is, why do we say that African fertility is still relatively high? Is it falling as fast as you would expect, considering the change in income and improving health? Well, I think it is still relatively high, certainly if you compare TFRs around the world. And again, it's hard to say what that best rate of decline would be. When I look at the levels of contraceptive use and of unmet need, there's certainly a great potential for it to come down.
Well, fertility in Africa is certainly quite high, and I think the pauses that you mentioned, why does it pause? Well, we can speculate. We could say that when family planning is introduced and the government and NGOs make a big effort, that there may well be a group who are really ready to take it up, to really start limiting family size. And so you would see the birth rate drop from maybe 6 to 4.5 children. After that, then in part because you may be having to deal with a large rural population that are harder to reach, that it tends to stall out. And, and also because the desired number of children does remain high, and I'm not so sure in Africa that incomes are rising as much as we might think.
Carl, here's a good question for you. We show the Netherlands population increasing by 2050 despite its below replacement fertility. And I think that's sometimes hard for people to grasp, that fertility can be below replacement, but a population can still grow. That's certainly been the case in the United States. Do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, that's basically what we call a population momentum. that just because a country goes below 2 children per woman, it does not stop growing right away. So if you remember back to that demographic divide, the Netherlands, despite having a 1.7 birth rate, has 176,000 births and 141,000 deaths. Now, yes, those two things are going to equalize in perhaps 10 or 15 years, and then Netherlands will begin to see its population decline. There is, of course, a second factor there. It's immigration. And immigration is pretty unpredictable. The birth rate doesn't go up and down very rapidly, normally anyway, but immigration does. Immigration can vary greatly depending on the country's economy. So it's, what we call population momentum, and it simply won't stop for a little while, but it will.
And as we project Africa ahead, one of our callers has made the point that there's a lot of efforts that are being made now to bring fertility down in Africa. Improved access to family planning, real increases in education, efforts to improve women's empowerment, and if you take all of those positive changes into effect, are we being pessimistic? And I don't think so. Because we're taking them into consideration, but also looking back at what we see as the actual levels of use of contraception, the TFRs, and the expected childbearing.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, because although those things may be happening, are they happening enough? But we do have the surveys that show us, as we saw earlier, the actual trend of the birth rate. So I think, in a sense, the proof is in the pudding.
Now, do we have any problem with those questions about ideal children if that's colored too much by the childbearing that women have already experienced? If I've already had 3 children,
sure,
maybe it's hard for me to say I have an ideal number sure, that's smaller than 3.
Yeah, and there is another variable in the DHS that shows the women who wish to cease childbearing by the number of children that they already have. And frequently in Africa, that is at the 6+ limit. So really, that's a good variable too, because you don't have to say that a child is unwanted.
Here's a good question for us data wonks here. Why do we say 2.1 and not 2.0 is the replacement rate?
Oh, well, that's actually it's partially because the total fertility rate is not the best measure of the replacement level. The 2.1 is actually rounded. It's in a high life expectancy country, it's about 2.06. And that little funny number is due to the sex ratio at birth. The fact that normally there's 105 males born per 100 females. There are much better measures. One is called the net reproduction rate, but we usually don't get into that because it's just a lot simpler to say the 2-child family. And if I could just add to that, the 2.1 is only in the country with a high life expectancy. In countries that have life expectancy in the 40s or 50s, they can actually reach replacement level with 3 children. The difference is that between that and the high life expectancy countries is that larger numbers of women do not survive to the end of their childbearing years, let's say in Niger, the way they would in the Netherlands. So it's actually a bit of a moving target, and it would take more explanation than the time we have now.
So in other words, it would seem that if a husband and wife each had, if that couple had 2 children, that's replacing them. But that number really has to be a little bit higher because, in fact, there will be some mortality, either
sure. Yeah.
Couples who don't live through their reproductive years or babies that don't live.
Yes, a larger number of women, unfortunately, in Niger will die before reaching, say, age 50, the end of their childbearing years. And so the women who survive have to have more children to compensate for that.
I wonder if anyone would notice that there were more infant deaths in Florida than there were in the Netherlands. And yes, that is a pretty significant difference there. Florida is a very diverse state. And if I had done a comparison with New York City I could have done New York City comparison. And there, if we talked about the greater metropolitan area, which is, a little bit larger than the size of the Netherlands, in fact, the number of infant deaths would have been fewer than you saw in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is much more of an urbanized environment, and it's a very compact area. It's very good health services, and so the number of infant deaths you see is going to vary. But good pickup there from one of our listeners. How about, are contraceptives available to women in developing countries? Are they expensive? Well, that's an interesting question, because there are some traditional methods that, of course, come with no kind of ongoing cost, but they're not terribly effective. Then there are methods that are very effective, but in fact, the cost may be significant. Now, the costs for contraceptive methods in developing countries tend to be subsidized so that they are within the reach of the families who need them. The thing I'd caution about is that it's easy to look at just sort of what that price is. What's the sticker price of injections or the sticker price of implants? It's also very important to look at the kind of other things that go around. If I have to walk for a day to get to a clinic, that's a real cost, and that doesn't show up necessarily in that sticker price. So there can be other costs to using methods than just the sticker price, even though the sticker prices tend to be down at a range where they're accessible to most couples in developing countries. Carl, we didn't have a population pyramid showing the entire population in the U.S. in 2013. Would that have shown us anything very different from the ones that we saw today by looking at the white non-Hispanic and the Hispanic population?
Yeah, it would look quite a bit different, say, than the one we did show for Japan. It would have how to put it, a more slab-sided appearance, and it would not have as big a tuck underneath at the bottom. Because immigrants do help keep the country quite young. And that is one way, certainly significantly, that we differ from Europe.
And because of the impact of immigration in the United States, and that's fairly recent, if we had done the whole population, you wouldn't have seen the baby boom pop out as much as it did in the way we presented it.
Well, yeah, because the white non-Hispanic population is still quite large, so it would certainly show up. But, one other thing, too, we have to think about is when we see the Hispanic population, that it's younger, because there's a lot of recent immigrants, but they're going to age, too. They're going to move up the age ladder and, and join the 65 and over in greater numbers.
Absolutely. Now, we have a question here. We may have confused some of our listeners here about the sex ratio. So basically, the sex ratio at birth in general is about 105 or 106 males to 100 females being born. Now, Carl may want to add to this, but we certainly see some parts of the world where it's quite concerning when that sex ratio is really out of balance. And when it's out of balance, it's usually there are more males being born than that basic sex ratio.
Well, actually, almost always, I think. Yes, certainly in India, in China, now also in Vietnam, the sex ratio at birth it definitely favors males if there is a great premium placed on male births. And, of course, that's due to sex-selective abortion. And in countries like India, they are campaigning very hard against that, although it's a fairly deep-rooted tradition that sons are more valued, unfortunately, than females. And that's the same in parts of East Asia, although not in Japan. Japan has a fairly normal sex ratio at birth. And I might say, too, in some of the states of India, there has been some improvement over the last 12 years. But lately, the Indian vital statistics suggest that has slowed down a bit.
I think when you talk about a country as big and diverse as India, it's important to realize that it's hard to have simple generalizations. A problem may be very acute in some areas and then not so apparent in other areas. India is just so large and so diverse that it's hard to have those generalizations.
Yes, well, in India, the situation is the worst in Punjab, which is also a fairly high-income state. And this enables couples to pay for the ultrasound test and determine the sex of the child. That's illegal now in India, but it still goes on.
Well, we have a question about how we think global migration might affect population distribution. Boy, I think that's a great question. One of the ways global migration does affect the kind of phenomenon we're talking about is what's called labor migration. People move for work, and that move may not be permanent. We see labor migration from some countries like Bangladesh into the Arab oil states. We certainly see labor migration to the U.S. One of the things that comes with migration like that is remittances back to the country of origin. And the data on remittances is absolutely amazing. There's huge flows of money from migrants back to their homes, and sometimes it's directly back to their families. That can have a very important effect on the ability of those families to invest in their child's education and health. And yet, if you see an economic blip in a wealthy country, sometimes that cascades back to what happens in those countries of origin. Maybe your question is whether we think that that's a strategy to deal with the apparent labor shortages that we're going to see in some of the industrialized countries. And I guess I'd have to say we see it already. The question is really how extreme that could become. Carl?
Well, yeah, the industrialized countries, particularly in Europe, have been grappling with this now for years. And it's a kind of a complex mix of the receiving country wishing that the immigrants will assimilate and become quite a bit like the the native population. There is some concern in countries that it's happening that they're worried about another culture growing there. Another concern is that the immigrants who come in become somewhat dependent on the social welfare system. So what they're looking for in many cases is people with skills who can come in and really contribute to the labor force. But it's a very touchy situation.
Well, that's always a touchy situation, but in fact some of these countries are actually really improving their economies as well. Certainly Mexico's economy is growing, yeah. And the ability to come to the U.S., work for a while, build some resources, and maybe not, I don't know what those population pyramids are going to look like in another 10 or 20 years, because we don't know what that immigration pattern is going to be.
Sure. I mean, there's always a bit of anxiety when a new group comes in. In the U.S., for example, when the Italians and the Poles and the Irish came, there was concern about that. Benjamin Franklin was worried about Germans. But, like in Germany, for example, Turks have assimilated fairly well from what I've seen, and they're even in Parliament.
Here's a question for you, Carl. UN Population Office revised their 2050 world population projections this year, and they project about 9.6 billion, but we're projecting 9.7. Please don't tell me that's just a rounding error. Do you want to talk about
Sure.
The difference in assumptions?
Sure. Actually, going out 37 years, 9.6 and 9.7 are pretty much the same number. We do have somewhat higher projections for sub-Saharan Africa, and a few others, like especially Pakistan, that recently reported a birth rate or total fertility rate of 3.8 rather than the 3.2 that had been assumed. So yes, there are some differences, but they're actually fairly minor. That's a long way off 2050.
Now, we talked a little bit about the potential for recession to actually cause fertility rates to go down, and we've got one question about whether we would anticipate that they would rebound, and I think that's a really interesting question. The answer, of course, is we don't know, but one of the things about fertility is that couples have a lot of latitude as to when they have births.
Sure, timing.
Timing is everything. And so you can decide that now is not a good time. You're still going to have that next birth, but you're waiting. So sometimes when you see a short-term decline, it just means that people have postponed until there's a more propitious time. But sometimes opportunities, foregone.
Sure. I mean, I remember the 1970s when we were all waiting in gas lines and house prices were climbing rapidly, and we had our lowest total fertility rate in 1976, which is oddly enough our bicentennial year, of 1.7, and then the recovery was slow. We maintained about a 1.8 TFR for much of the 1980s, and then it got up to 2.1 in recent years.
And we're looking at some improvements we might make in the data sheet. I'm really happy to see that people are already looking at the data sheet, and I hope you're looking at the infographic, that how you can use the data sheet for projections or for looking at time trends. Let's say time trends rather than projections, and we're looking at some ways we might add even more features to the data sheet in coming years. So we're always open to hearing suggestions. Last year we went out and asked about what kind of topics you would like to see for the special columns, and it's always helped us to get a sense of what our, the users of the data sheet would like to see, what they find most valuable, how you use it. We'd love to know how you use it, how it could be of more use to you.
And also I might say, please, if you have any questions about data for a particular country, just let us know and we'll tell you what we used, and we'd be happy to discuss it because we often learn a good deal from talking with people who do use the publication.
And clearly, those of you who have taken the time to tune in to this webinar are really involved and engaged in these issues. And we will take the remaining questions that we have and see, maybe Carl, you could do a blog on some of these, because people have raised interesting questions we don't have time for today about the impact of the availability of water, the relationship between TFR and contraceptive prevalence rate. So we've got some other questions here, and I think we're coming to the end of our time here, so I think maybe this is going to give you the impetus for a new blog. How about that, Carl?
Oh, that sounds just fine. And we're already starting to look at updates for the 2014 data sheet.
Yes.
Starts right away.
It starts right away. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the data sheet, and one of the things that's just pleases me so much here is to see that this is a tool that we've had out there for decades and decades, that people love.
1962, yes.
Started in 1962, and it's something that each year we look to how we can make it better, how we can make it more useful to you, what kind of new graphics or videos we can embed in the data sheet for you. So please always send us your comments about how you use it or what you would like to see, because we're certainly open to all of those improvements. It's a tried and true product here from PRB, but it's certainly one that we always want to have be the most useful as it can for you. So thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the time to join in. If you have colleagues who weren't able to join in, this will be archived on our website, and we'll also provide other related material there for you. Thank you again.